Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? On this video, right, I wanted to break down the steps and the reducibility of giving live birth as opposed to laying eggs, right? Because that is a transition that does not have to happen spontaneously, like in a single step, like, oh, there's like a single mutation where you go from something that lays eggs in the traditional way to something that gives live birth in the way we do. Um, it doesn't have to happen like so spontaneously like that. So I already have done videos before on the evolutionary reducibility of the human reproductive system. You know, I've done one on the anatomy and I've done one on the behaviors of having sex, right? Because there's also evolutionary reducibility of the behaviors in which we have sex, right? Um, but in those videos, right, I mostly talked in broad terms, going over the major steps, right? But even many of those steps, right, there are steps in between those steps and steps in between those steps and so on, right? And so many of them we could, you know, for a specific transition, focus in and give more of the details, right? So that's what I'm doing on this video with the transition from laying eggs to live birth, right? It doesn't, that in of itself is not really a single step that just like happens like spontaneously, like some type of like miraculous thing, like a comic book or something. It actually can happen so gradually that it's mostly the same as it was before any individual point along the way, right? So first off, this is something I've already covered on other videos. Because we're placentals, right, we have umbilical cords and long gestation, right? But these do not need to come about in the same step all at once as the transition to live birth. They can come later after live birth has already been evolved as, you know, further specializations, right? They themselves can be broken down into many steps, which I can make videos on that, but that is not the focus of this video, right? It's specifically the transition to giving live birth rather than laying eggs, right? But so, even the marsupial type of reproductive system, right? Because so the marsupials, right? We see in them they give live birth, right? But they have much shorter gestation and no umbilical cord, right? So then that shows, right, that the umbilical cord and long gestation can come later. They don't need to come about in the same step as live birth, right? Because you have other groups like marsupials, right, which have no umbilical cord and have shorter gestation, and yet they still give live birth and they have a placenta. But even to go to a more marsupial-like reproductive system, there still is a lot of intermediate between that and egg laying, right? So one of the earliest steps that can happen in a transition from egg laying to live birth is egg retention, right? Because what we see in the animal kingdom, there are many groups, right, which the egg hatches inside of the mother, so they technically are giving live birth, right? And yet otherwise their reproductive methodology is much more like that of many creatures that do lay eggs than it is like ours or even marsupials, right? Because they retain many of the features of the egg that we do not, right? Like the shell in many of these groups, and they don't have certain features like the placenta, right? In some of these groups, right? Um, and yet they still are technically giving live birth, right? Because the egg hatches inside of the mother, right? Um, and even to go to that, even that does not have to be a spontaneous change that happens in a single step, a single mutation, because amongst creatures that do lay eggs, different groups have different amounts of time that the mother keeps the egg inside of it before laying the egg, right? It's not all the same for different groups. Certain groups keep it in the mother for much longer periods than others, and yet still do lay eggs, right? And all amniotes, right? So reptiles, birds, which technically are reptiles, birds, and not amphibians, sorry. Not amphibians, but reptiles, birds, mammals, right? That's amniotes. All amniotes that still reproduce sexually, right? Fertilize internally, right? And so all amniotes that reproduce sexually, the mother keeps a fertilized egg within its body for some amount of time, right? Even the ones that lay eggs, the mother still has a fertilized egg inside of it for some amount of time before it lays the egg. Certain egg laying amniotes keep it within them for longer amounts of time than others. Some, significantly longer, a very long amount of time compared to certain other groups that the egg is in the mother before it lays eggs, right? And so even to go from like laying eggs to egg retention, where it's mostly the same, but the egg hatches in the mother, even that does not have to happen like spontaneously in a single step. It can happen very gradually, with the mother, having the egg inside of it for a longer and longer amount of time before laying it, to eventually, keeping it in up to just before, like laying it just before it hatches, eventually just getting to the point of where it hatches inside of the mother, which is then technically live birth, but otherwise mostly the same, right? Then once you have that reproductive system, which, as I said, we have creatures alive today, many groups of animals where there's no placenta, they retain many features of the egg that we don't have, in many ways very much like an egg-laying creature, but they technically give live birth because the egg hatches in the mother, inside of the mother, before it hatches, it hatches inside of the mother, right? Once you already have creatures that are like that, they can more and more specialize towards that reproductive method, right? So gradually evolving features like the placenta and losing certain features of the egg, right? As they specialize towards that reproductive method, right? And so there doesn't have to ever any step along the way be this like crazy, like wild, spontaneous, miraculous like transition that like seems like some type of like thing out of a comic book, where like, oh, like out of nowhere it's like so different. It can actually happen so gradually that any single point along the way is mostly the same as it was before, right? And yet still in the long run become very different than it originally was. So, all right, that's all for now. See you guys.